I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. There were two big debates swirling around Parliament this week. One, a short-term conundrum: should interest rates keep rising? The other carries longer-term ramifications. How should Australia go about cutting carbon emissions? The government's plan to achieve its emissions target has broad support outside Parliament, just not within. The Coalition calls it a carbon tax. The Greens are worried it won't stop new coal and gas projects. And I'll be joined a little later by their leader, Adam Bandt. All sides are digging into their trenches. No one wants to upset their base. The Reserve Bank Governor, meanwhile, has less of a problem making unpopular decisions. Philip Lowe knows people are angry and hurting after 9 interest rate rises and the prospect of more to come. I was joined on the panel today by Dana Morse, Shane Wright and Samantha Maiden. Let's start on how Philip Lowe went. Shane, 2 committees that he fronted, I think about 5 hours in total that he took questions for. What did we learn?
That he's a very good performer in front of parliamentarians. That senators still need a bit of work on how to ask questions of a Reserve Bank governor.
Right. What's your point there?
Well, because you can see in the House committee they deal with the governor every 6 months. And you can see it's a bigger group of them. There, for the first time, there are actually 3 trained economists on the House Economics Committee.
One of them particularly well trained.
Well, Dan Molino, Andrew Charlton and Allegra Spender. Yeah. They have a grounding in that space, but they are more used to dealing with the governor and trying to tease out things. And Jerome Laxall, the new member for Bennelong, the most questions we've ever actually seen of a Reserve Bank governor about renters and what's happening to them because of what's going on with interest rates. But the senators, they're still coming to terms with how you work together. You can work together as a group,
as a committee,
and to really they were different. They were going for different.
But what did we
things.
learn from Philip Lowe?
That he's not for turning at this stage, and it's interesting because Reserve Bank governors or any central bankers are very good at not answering the question that you really want to learn or to get some information out. For instance, I was surprised there was this, oh my God, the Reserve Bank Governor and the Treasurer don't talk about the direction of interest rates. It would be an extraordinary situation if the Treasurer of the day was telling the Reserve Bank Governor, oh, I think this is what you should be doing.
Yeah, I thought that was a little surprising as well. They talk about the economy, obviously, and where it's going.
Yeah.
But what's the expectation that the Treasurer is going to say, But I'll tell you what, the Assistant Treasurer is...
He has no troubles.
In fact, here he is. He's amongst those giving free advice to the Reserve Bank about what they should do.
There's plenty of evidence that the stuff that's already in the system, the interest rate rises that are already in the system, are pulling money out of the economy and dampening down on demand. And we are concerned that further increases are going to put pressure on households and businesses that are already doing it tough.
Yeah, he's the Assistant Treasurer, Sam. He says he's speaking on behalf of the government. Is that appropriate?
Well, they're playing a game here, and that game involves the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, maintaining the position that he wouldn't possibly, can you believe it, how dare you even suggest it, give advice to the RBA about how to set rates, that they are independent. And this is a game that works on 2 levels politically. Labor needs to blame the rate rises on the RBA. They need that distance, right, because they don't want to be blamed for what is going on. Equally, they need to send a message to voters that they're concerned about this, right? And so that's why you have Stephen Jones has clearly been authorised to say that. I mean, do you seriously, I mean, obviously you don't, or you, but no one thinks that Stephen Jones went out doing that without telling the PMO and whatever. But the only other thing I'd pick up on is that idea that it was, extraordinary or whatever. Basically what the RBA governor said was, we haven't spoken about rates. Now, I take your point, and it's a very insider's view that, of course, they wouldn't, how ridiculous. Yeah. But my point is, but for voters, right, that is a dangerous claim, right? Because there is also a risk that voters will listen to that and go, what are you doing? Of course. And of course he said they talk about the economy all the time, they're going to India together and all the rest of it. But I think that's the complexity to it, that the government's walking a line where they have to be seen to be emoting about interest rates.
Reflecting what they're hearing.
But similarly,
respecting the
not us, that's not us.
Look, whatever they're doing, it doesn't sound like Philip Lowe is swayed by any of this. He appears untroubled by the pressure, if we can call it that, that's coming, including from the government here. He's sticking to his line that these interest rate rises are absolutely necessary.
I don't think we're at the peak yet, but how far we have to go up, I don't know. It's going to depend upon the inflation data, the resilience of spending, the strength of the global economy and what's happening with prices and wages.
Yeah, so Dana, another clear sign from the governor that there are more rises coming.
Not hitting the brakes yet at all, but really when you look at interest rates, it's a blunt instrument and it's clearly not having the desired effect because we haven't seen that reduction in inflation after 9 consecutive increases. And I thought what was very difficult to hear this week alongside that is, and the news that, they're not going to pump the brakes yet, is massive corporate profits. I mean, the profits that the Commonwealth Bank posted this week while their clients are buckling under mortgage stress is very difficult to hear. So really, this is on the government. They need to do more on fiscal policy to make sure that it's not being disproportionately impacted, particularly on mortgage holders, and then on renters as well, who are getting these, interest rate rises passed directly onto them.
Well, this did come up in the various committees, right? What else can you do, right? If it's not interest rates, what else can you do about inflation? Now, both Phil Lowe and the head of Treasury, Stephen Kennedy, made the point, Shane, that this is the most speedy, most nimble way, I think was the word, to deal with inflation. Yes, in theory, you could increase the GST, you could do all sorts of things, but to get that through the Parliament, to get either side of politics to agree to a tax increase, this is going to take a very long time. What are the other options, though, when we talk about getting inflation down, if not interest rates? Because every talkback radio station is having this conversation. Why does it have to be interest rates?
Because that's the mechanism as the economic fraternity have decided over the last 35 years, and they've had a very good run, and that's why we're actually in this place, that targeting inflation is the best way.
Is there another way?
You're right. It's like Dana's right that at the Reserve Bank, it's got an interest rate hammer, and every problem is a nail. So that's what they have to use, and that's what the Reserve Bank has done for a very long time.
But then they should
tried
rethink.
to tease that question out at the beginning of the first on the Wednesday, and she was basically inviting him to kind of
have a crack
at the government, and he didn't really do that. I mean, he mentioned the the energy policy and the idea that would have some impact.
Well, he said it's putting downward pressure on inflation, those price
No,
caps.
exactly.
That's helping.
Because the RBA's own research shows at least half of the inflation issue that we've got at the moment is from overseas. So there's nothing that a government, a domestic government or a Reserve Bank can do to target that. It's what you do with the other 40%. That's what we're really talking about. And this is partly why the Reserve Bank's actually in a bit of trouble. Governments, state and federal, have used a lot of stimulus to get through the COVID pandemic. The Reserve Bank created $380 billion, pumped that out through the economy, as well as taking the cash rate to 0.1.
And he made some admissions about that as well in the hearings, he basically said that we may have done too much. But I mean, on your point of the bank profits, he also defended that and then nervously
Philip Lowe
giggled.
did. Yeah, he did. He sort of said, he didn't seem to have a problem with it and said, over time.
We need a strong bank.
But the Treasurer's clearly
got a problem.
attuned to this. He's announced the ACCC is going to have a look at how interest rates
as they should
magically go up so quickly for mortgage holders, but take a little longer for depositors to see that benefit as well.
Yeah. But we saw in both the Westpac and Commonwealth Bank statements this week that there is this little uptick in what's going on at the pain level in terms of the people who may be starting to feel a bit of pain. And I think one of the most telling points was from Brad Jones from the Reserve Bank on Friday, where he said, look, about half of people are up to 2 years ahead on their mortgages. But there's this 10% who at the moment have run out of spare cash.
They're not saving anything.
And they are low-income earners, and they are living in the outer suburbs. And you had Tanya Lawrence, say, from Hasluck, you had Bert van Manum from the LNP, outer suburb of Brisbane. They are the ones who are really picking up what's going on.
Yeah, he said 10% of people on variable, you know, but that's another interesting part of the equation, because, you know, the bank is almost trying to be suggesting, oh, don't worry, it's only 10% of people who are on variable. But we're about to get a big pipeline of people that are on fixed, right? Yeah, so that number is going to...
Not to mention all the renters.
...go a lot bigger.
Yeah.
And I actually thought that it was really good that Labor was asking all those questions about renters, because I think that is a big concern in the community.
What about for the government, though? I mean, they've got a neutral budget setting, as it was put by both Philip Lowe and Stephen Kennedy. What will they have to do in May, though? I mean, Dana, you're talking about what they can do with fiscal policy to help put some downward pressure on inflation. It ain't necessarily easy, though, is it, when they've got a lot of pressure to do more on JobSeeker and Medicare and all these...
None of this is easy when you're doing it on the run. Like, what we have here is a failure of long-term policy, a failure of planning, a failure to look at the way that the RBA works and the way that we address the economy over decades, not over the last 18 months. So what the government, if it was brave, could be doing is looking long-term here and looking for how do we avoid this in 5-10 years' time, when we may not be in government and we may not reap the benefits, but the Australian people will. But in terms of
aren't they doing that a little bit through the inquiry into how the RBA operates?
Well, we'll have to see if they pick up the findings. We do a lot of inquiries that end up on the shelf. But in terms of May, I mean, it's energy policy that they've got the most and best chance of putting more downward pressure on and reforming that in the long term, so that we're not paying international prices for domestic energy.
I think just in that, like last year in the pre-election budget, the previous government expanded and increased the low and middle income tax offset. It pumped $12 billion into the economy between July and about October. In terms of inflationary, that is it. That is, if you want to talk about inflation, let's just hand $12 billion out to people and you can see what happens. This year, that's 10.5 million people will have a substantial increase in their tax. They are not getting nearly as much. That is anti-inflationary, and people don't want to talk about that.
What about next year? Stage
three, and that's where you get to stage 3. Of course, what is going to, if anyone here wants to put a bet on what inflation will be, July 1 next year.
They are factored into the forecasts for inflation.
And the forecast inflation of the Reserve Bank also takes into account those tax cuts. That's still part and parcel of what is flowing through and is predicating a lot of what's going on in the terms of the forecasts of the RBA.
Well, time to talk to the Greens leader, Adam Bandt, now. And to take us there, he was the Reserve Bank Governor, on why these rate rises are necessary.
There is a risk on the other side. There is a risk that we have not yet done enough with interest rates, and spending is more resilient, and that inflation stays high. If inflation stays high, it's very damaging for the economy. It worsens income inequality. It makes it harder for businesses to plan. It erodes the value of people's savings.
Adam Bandt, welcome to the program.
Hi, David.
So inflation is still at 7.8%, highest it's been in more than 30 years. What's your answer to bringing it down?
Well, it's not everyday people who are driving inflation. It's not wages that's driving inflation. As your panel and some of the evidence mentioned, you've got the Commonwealth Bank posting record profits off the back of interest rates going up. It is corporate profiteering that is going a large way to driving inflation. That's something the government can do something about. The government can also step in and relieve some of the cost of living pressure on people by doing things like a national plan to freeze rents, looking at getting dental into Medicare to relieve some of the cost of living pressures on people. Government's got a lot of levers at its disposal. It's not pulling them at the moment, and it needs to revisit the stage 3 tax cuts. That's $250 billion.
Okay, so that's next year. But
right now, it's a big black hole in the budget that everything is it's pulling everything into its gravitational field.
But right now, you are saying cap rents and increase corporate taxes.
Yeah, look at these big banks, these big gas corporations that are driving up energy prices. Freeze electricity bills. We've just given the government the power to do that at the end of last year. And we can fund it by making these big corporations pay their fair share of tax. That will not only help with inflation, it'll help everyday people deal with the cost of living crisis.
I mean, the reality is, as the Reserve Bank Governor pointed out, is you need legislation for all of these things. Good luck getting those things through Parliament. It would take quite some time. In the meantime, your colleague Nick McKim has called on the Treasurer to step in and override the Reserve Bank and reverse this latest interest rate rise. Is that a serious suggestion?
Well, the government does have the ultimate power to do this.
You're saying they should?
Well, it could do more than jawboning, right? And it can, at the moment, the interest rate rises are a very blunt tool, as your panellist said, when every problem looks, when all you've got is a hammer and every problem looks like a nail.
But should the Treasurer really override the Reserve Bank?
Well, the government has to look at what powers it's got and does have to look at whether now's the right time to step in, because this is hurting people and it's pushing the country closer to a recession.
Are you saying they should, though?
Well, the government does have to look at it because it's serious. They've got the power to do this because they've got other powers as well. At the moment, there's a lot of hand-wringing from the government, a lot of hand-wringing about this, but they're not pulling any of the levers that they can, and they're letting these big corporations continue to drive up inflation through corporate profiteering, and they're not doing what they should.
Do you support an independent Reserve Bank?
It needs to act within the guidelines of that the Parliament sets it, and having an independent Reserve Bank is important, but what are its goals? At the moment, its goals seem to be to keep pushing up interest rates regardless of the pain, because that's the only tool that it's got. And if the relationship between the government and the Reserve Bank is set in law in a way that makes everyday people pay the cost of problems that they haven't caused, then it does need a re-looking at. Yes, the government is looking at doing a review to look at the relationship between the Reserve Bank and the government. That's good, but that needs to actually look at the levers the government has as well.
Let's turn to climate change. The government says its planned changes to the safeguards mechanism will take some 200 million tonnes of carbon emissions out of the atmosphere. Would you seriously vote against that?
Well, let's look at that. All right, coal and gas are the main causes of the climate crisis. Any effective climate policy should bring down pollution from coal and gas. Labor's policy doesn't do that. In fact, it gets worse, right?
So it doesn't reduce emissions at all?
No. Look at what happens with coal and gas. Labor's own documents say pollution from gas is going to keep going up. Why? Because that 200 million tonnes that they're talking about, it could all just be on paper, because coal and gas pollution gets to keep going up as long as they buy tree planting permits on the other side of the country. And that's why it makes the problem worse. But B, what the safeguard mechanism does, as proposed by Labor, is allow unlimited new coal and gas mines to come into the system. Now, those coal and gas mines that are on the books at the moment are so big, it will wipe out any gains that are made from there. So they talk about maybe 200 million tonnes. That might all be on paper, maybe 200 million tonnes. Open up the Northern Territory gas fields, which Labor is talking about at the moment, and you are talking about 34 billion tonnes of pollution, new pollution going into the atmosphere. That's our concern. And that's why we've said, to come to your question, we've put an offer, not an ultimatum. It's an offer that says, we'll put aside our very real concerns with the Ponzi scheme elements of this plan where everything gets offset. We'll put aside the fact that we think you've got a low target that is going to mean the end of the Great Barrier Reef and that you're reheating Tony Abbott's safeguard mechanism. We will vote for it in full tomorrow if you do one thing. Stop making the problem worse. Stop opening new coal and gas projects, because you can't put the fire out while you're pouring petrol on it.
Has any other country banned new coal and gas projects?
Well, this is what the International Energy Agency.
Yeah, I know that.
The United Nations Secretary General, the world scientists.
Has anyone done it?
They're all saying this is what we've got to do. At the last
Has anyone done it? Was the question.
At the last Global Climate Summit, the UK, who was hosting that, they went along and they said, this has to be the summit that we start to talk about not opening any...
Sorry, my question was, has any country done this?
Well, I know some countries have certainly looked at it. I don't know that there's anyone taking the step yet, but Australia, as the third largest exporter of fossil fuel pollution, has a special responsibility, right? We can't ask other countries to do what we're not prepared to do ourselves.
Well, arguably that makes it harder economically for Australia. But the question was, coming back to the question, has any other country done this? You're not sure whether anyone's done it.
Well, someone's got to do it. Like, someone's got to go first. Our Pacific Island neighbours are pleading with us to stop opening new coal and gas projects, right? There will have to come a time, David, in human history, if we're to tackle the climate crisis, where we say we're not going to open any more, right? Now,
what would it cost?
Time,
have you done do you know any work done on what that would cost Australia?
Yeah, we ran to the election with a costed platform that said, looking at the royalties that would be coming into the federal government from the coal and gas projects, bearing in mind that we're not talking about existing ones, we're talking about new ones. Look at the damage that's going to be caused from the floods and the fires and the droughts if the climate crisis gets worse, and how much is being spent by communities at the moment just dealing with all of that. It's the only way
and just remind
to
us the cost.
save our economy at the moment.
And what was that cost?
Well, we're talking about, in terms of foregone royalty, you're talking from memory, somewhere in the order of hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Hundreds of millions of dollars, because bear in mind that these big gas corporations, 27 big gas corporations, brought in $77 billion of income in 1 year and paid no tax on it, right? The ATO has called these big gas corporations serial tax avoiders. That's why the hit to the economy is nowhere near as much as these corporations are making out. But the benefit, like, it's costing farmers, on average, $30,000 a year. At the moment, that's the climate crisis.
Okay, let me just come back
to...
to
It's a net benefit to the economy.
The decision you've got to make here. You mentioned again here that this is an offer you're making, not an ultimatum.
Yes.
So is that a suggestion really, or is it a red line? Coming back again to this question, would you really vote against this plan?
Well, it's a proposal to Labor to say we'll pass your scheme in full. If you, Labor, think it's so important to keep opening new coal and gas projects in a climate crisis...
If they say no, and they're saying no...
Well, I don't think that position is ultimately tenable, and I don't think the government, the penny has quite dropped with the government how much things have moved on. 66% of people between 18 and 34 back our position, don't want new coal and gas mines open. 57% of the general population, right? Things have moved on. I know Labor talks a lot about history, but the students who are marching in the streets at the moment behind banners saying no new coal and gas were in primary school in 2009.
Well, yeah.
They do not want... No one can understand why, we're coming up to the year anniversary of the floods in Lismore, people cannot understand why Labor says that they want to open up new projects.
And clearly you campaigned very strongly on this. So with this negotiation, if you don't get something from the government, if you don't walk away from this with some movement from the government on new coal and gas projects, are you worried some of those who voted Greens will wonder what's the point of the party?
Oh, look, we're obviously a fair way away from seeing what happens here. We've put a position, and it's now up to Labor.
The point is you've got to get something, though, haven't you?
Well, B, I think people can see that we're the only ones in Parliament at the moment fighting to stop coal and gas mines being opened.
And if you don't get something for that fight, again, what's the point of the Greens?
Well,
right?
Why does Labor want to go to the wall to open new coal and gas projects? Like, these are huge climate bombs. They've got a very... I think it's an untenable task.
I'm just talking about the Greens, though. For your party, this is a high-stakes moment, right? And for your leadership.
People know that we are fighting our hardest to stop Labor opening new coal and gas mines. There's 118 in the pipeline. Labor's own papers say they want to open at least 6 of these or 7 of these new massive gas fields under the safeguard mechanism. People know that we are in there fighting. That's what they expect us to do. And let's remember the last election. Labor's vote went backwards. Right? The Coalition's vote went backwards. The Greens and the Independents, whose vote went up, said it's time to stop opening new coal and gas. That penny has to drop with the government at some point.
Let me just ask you a couple of compromise options here, and we'll try not to get too technical on the changes here to the safeguards mechanism. The Climate Council is saying, what about pausing new coal and gas until the EPBC Act, the Environmental Approvals Act, is toughened? Would you support that?
I think that's a proposal that's worth having a look at. I mean, we've already compromised a lot, and we've said we'll compromise on targets, we will compromise on how quickly we're going to make the change, we'll compromise on the offsets. There's one thing we're asking for: don't make the problem worse. some others have put proposals
Well,
like that
I'm just going to
on.
run a couple of others past you. The Australia Institute, it's also put forward an idea. You've got concerns about the offsets, and so do many people. What if companies could still put their money into an offset, or put it into a dedicated fund for decarbonisation that the government would control, so you know the money's, well, you have some greater surety that the money's going to be well spent?
Look, we're up for good faith discussions, and proposals like that are coming from people like the Climate Council, from the Australia Institute. We've seen the Australian Conservation Foundation out this week saying there's serious design problems with the government's proposal. What about putting a climate trigger in our environment laws, for example? All of those things are things that we would look at, right?
Okay.
And you've seen in the past, like we didn't support the government's climate targets, but we managed to land a place and pass the climate bill. Electric vehicle legislation, the energy legislation last year that reserves gas domestically, we had concerns about that, but we passed it.
And just
We're
finally,
prepared to have
okay,
those.
it sounds like you're
discussions.
open for some compromise here, getting something from the government. Is there a prospect too, just finally, of cross trading? You're also battling the government on their National Reconstruction Fund and their Social Housing Fund. Could you see a scenario where they give you a bit more on something else to get you over the line on this?
Well, two things. One is that one of the things that ties some of those policies together is that Labor's policies are making things worse at the moment. They stand to make the problems worse, and we're trying to stop that. But secondly, look, it has to deal with this question of coal and gas, right? It has to deal with this question of new coal and gas mines. There's no justification for opening them up in a climate crisis. You can't put the fire out while you're pouring petrol on it. First step in fixing a problem is stop making it worse. We're up for the good faith discussions. The onus is now on Labor to explain why it wants more coal and gas in a climate crisis.
Adam Bandt, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks, David.
Let's get back to our panel, and we're joined once more by Dana Morse and Shane Wright and Samantha Maiden. Let's just have a look at that. Well, firstly, the government's position, Sam. Any chance they're going to ban new coal and gas projects?
I wouldn't have thought.
Right. So what did you take from that? Is Adam Bandt seriously going to, and the Greens, seriously going to vote down this safeguards mechanism if they don't get that ban?
Well, you know, I don't know what's going to happen at this stage, right? And I think there is a lot of pressure on the Greens to not always fold. There is the spectre and the ghostly haunting of the, you know, the Kevin Rudd CPRS debate. I mean, but look, I don't know what's going to happen. I assume that someone's going to have to shift.
There's a fair bit at stake for all sides here, Shane, isn't there? I mean, the coalition's kind of dealt themselves out of the process by saying no, but that carries risks for them in the teal seats.
Oh, those teal seats, yeah.
Labor needs this to pass because this is their pathway to you know, climate change targets. And the Greens, as I was discussing there, they need to get something out of this too, right?
Yeah, and I think you're right where Bandt was talking about some of the other areas, for instance, a climate trigger being put into legislation. You can see the Greens, they don't want to become not just what happened in 2009, what happened to the Democrats in 2000 and coming up with a deal over the GST. Yeah. That there's plenty of history of what happens if you block or get involved. They say it's a fine line that Adam Bandt's trying to walk, as well as Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton. They've all got a lot at stake, let alone the environment, which is what this is supposed to be, and hitting those targets that everyone seems to have agreed upon, but getting there, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Dana, I know you've been covering the safeguards issue. There are, you know, without getting too much into the weeds of the technicalities here, there are clearly options, right, where the government might be able to change the cap that it's put on the price of offsets. It might be able to you know, restructure where companies can put their money and so on to give people a bit more comfort around the offsets. Do you see a way through this?
Well, I think it was pretty telling what Adam Bandt just said, that it's an offer, not an ultimatum. It certainly sounds like an ultimatum, but it seems like the Greens are going to be more flexible than they're putting out there as their first position. Interesting negotiation tactic. It means that they will have to back down, but it's the talk around that EBPC potential offset changes. I mean, that's what it seems would be the most helpful thing to go after here, would be significant reform around these offsets, because that's what's going to actually force these companies to reduce their emissions rather than buy their way out of them.
Yeah, and look, you've got the negotiations that will take place privately between Chris Bowen, the Minister, and and Adam Bandt and are taking place. But publicly, you've got a fair bit of posturing. We heard a little bit of it there from the Greens. From Labor, there's just as much sort of belting them over the head publicly. Have a look.
This is no surprise coming from the Liberals and Nationals. They've never pretended to care about the environment. But I think that Greens voters would actually be shocked to see Greens members of Parliament getting ready to sit next to Peter Dutton and Barnaby Joyce to vote against action on climate change.
That may be so, Sam, but I suspect Labor voters too, in a seat like Tanya Plibersek's seat of Sydney, probably don't like the idea of new coal and gas being brought online either, right?
Yeah, and this is the problem with the embrace of democracy in the Labor Party. They obviously have a membership that has a view that is often more to the left than the parliamentary party, and in some cases more to the left than they need to, win subsequent terms.
And just on that, the substance of this argument, Shane, new coal and gas. Coal is clearly being phased out. Now, Adam Bandt's right to point out, as he has, that new coal mines are still being approved, although Tanya Plibersek recently blocked one. But gas, the government's pretty adamant that we're going to need gas to get to net zero. This is a transition fuel. You're going to need it for manufacturing critical minerals.
You're going to need a second job to pay for it.
Well, it's interesting.
Why do we need it?
Well, you had the discussion there. There's not that much difference between the approach of the Greens on interest rates. We're saying, look, let's reverse the last decision because it's causing pain. Closing down coal and gas would cause pain to all those communities that rely on those for jobs or rely on those industries that need the feedstock of gas or need the feedstock of relatively cheap energy. We don't want to live with the pain of one decision, but the pain of another. We'll not discuss that too openly.
Let's turn to the Voice to Parliament. A week of action in support of trying to build momentum for the Voice has begun. The Prime Minister attended a barbecue yesterday afternoon in his electorate. I'm not sure how many still need to be convinced in that part of Sydney. A lot of support there. But this week of action, Dana, explain to us, what's it actually going to involve?
Well, there's going to be events and roundtables and meetings and town halls across the country led by the From the Heart group. They are affiliated with the Uluru Statement, but not the Uluru Statement. They're sort of taking the reins on the Yes campaign, and they'll have an official launch in Adelaide later next week. OK, well, the PM yesterday at that event, it was interesting. It was quite a strong speech where he really was hammering how the Voice will actually solve practical problems of closing the gap on disadvantage.
This is not about symbolism or practical outcomes. The Voice is a means to an end, to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia on education, on health, on housing, on incarceration rates, on life expectancy, on infant mortality, on all of these issues.
Shane, the week of action will involve yarning circles around the country. There's a lot of focus on WA this week in particular. Why WA?
Well, a referendum, you need a majority of the states as well as majority of voters. So WA, you do need to get that state over the line. There have been ongoing huge Indigenous issues across WA. Banksia Hill, the prison that they have for young offenders, has been a huge problem as well, and that gets all tied up into how to deal with practical issues to support and improve the lot of Indigenous Australians. And as you just heard Anthony Albanese talking about, there are a huge number of issues. And so getting WA, where you've got Dorinda Cox, the Greens' new spokesperson in that space, as well as the support base within the Labor Party over there, it is trying to get that message across from an area that is really a state that's really at the front line in dealing with issues around Indigenous Australians.
The PM's taking his whole cabinet over there for a meeting this week as well. A lot of the focus, though, right now in this whole debate still is on Peter Dutton and where he's going to land and what the coalition will do. Sam, do you think that's becoming any clearer where the opposition leader's going to go?
Well, I still think that they don't seem very enthusiastic about backing it. I mean, I'm a little dubious, though, just to return to your earlier point of this idea that somehow the voice will lead to a result on these practical outcomes. I mean, it would be wonderful if it did, but they've had all these issues with closing the gap. These problems are very intractable. Surely these problems are so important that if they needed to fix them, they should start doing that now. Now, I'm not saying that they're not. Of course, they're trying. But what makes them suddenly think that we haven't been able to solve these problems for decades?
Well, I think the argument is that when there's Indigenous involvement in running programs, the success rate has been significantly higher.
Sure.
So this is about having that involvement at the most senior level, advising the Parliament.
I just think that it's an easy thing to say. It's a more difficult thing to see if it's going to be delivered. And I take your point that there has been some sign of that. But I just, what worries me is that these problems are so intractable. I don't think that they can be magically...
But speaking, just to add to your point, why does the voice have to be a perfect piece of policy? Like, it's held to a higher standard, like all Indigenous affairs issues. Why does it have to be perfect? Why can't it be incremental? Why can't it make some of a difference? Why do we have to say the voice has got to fix all of these closing the gap issues from the get-go? Why not say it'll be one thing that helps?
Yeah, I don't know if anyone's saying it needs to fix everything on day one. I mean, clearly, in part, the argument flows from Peter Dutton's opposition, right? So he's saying, why are we doing this when we need to fix these problems? The government's saying, well, this will help address these problems. I mean, politically, one of the issues, though, that Peter Dutton still has is that this whole issue of, his failure to originally agree to the apology, his explanation for why that was, which relates to he didn't think it would have a practical impact, and then that connects again with his opposition to this. Like, there's a thread.
We've got that here because it was interesting. Monday was the 15th anniversary of that Kevin Rudd's apology to the Stolen Generations. Peter Dutton, on this anniversary on Monday, apologised for boycotting that apology back then.
I apologise for my actions, and the Prime Minister's frequently able to point it out that I didn't attend the chamber for the apology 15 years ago. I've apologised for that in the past, and I repeat that apology again today. I failed to grasp at the time the symbolic significance to the stolen generation of the apology.
Failed to grasp the symbolic significance. What was the importance of saying that right now, do you think, Dana?
Well, I mean, I think Peter Dutton's speaking out both sides of his mouth on this. Like, he apologised for not attending 15 years ago. He also didn't attend the anniversary breakfast and meet with those Stolen Generation survivors that he snubbed 15 years ago. But in terms of saying that he understands it now, he doesn't want to be seen as being hard-headed on Indigenous affairs issues and to be speaking over the top of Indigenous people. And he gets what he did wrong 15 years ago. The government have been calling into question whether he's going to make the same mistake this time around. And again, we've seen he met with the Referendum Working Group this week. In that meeting, he said, I agree with a voice. I agree with constitutional recognition. I agree we have intractable problems in closing the gap and that this would be a way to addressing those. But then he comes out and he says, well, I think the voice is not currently on track for success at a referendum. So really, he's politicising it.
Well, yeah, to be clear, he's saying he supports a voice but would like it legislated.
Yeah, not this voice. He supports a model.
Yeah. Within that working group, that referendum working group, there's also some discussion around whether it should be a voice to Parliament and executive government, as is currently proposed, or just a voice to Parliament. They had a discussion. There was agreement that they should stick with voice to Parliament and executive government. Just unpack for us why the pros and cons, the argument that's going on there.
The granular detail that is still going into this debate right before this legislation. This has to be finalised by the end of March, when the legislation is planned to go into the Parliament. So when they're saying about executive government, that was one lawyer who's on the Constitutional Working Group made that suggestion, unanimously shot down, we understand, by the rest of the Referendum Working Group. It's about having the power to speak to all layers of government. You could go back and say, well, if you have the power to speak to Parliament, the executive comes from the parliament, so you also have the power there. But it's outlining that, it's entrenching that, it's saying that that would be the expectation, not the exception to the rule.
I mean, yeah, some conservative constitutional experts worry that making an executive government would open up a lot more government decisions to court challenge and so on. But you're right, the working group are pretty unified now on that matter. Do you think Anthony Albanese will have to still give Peter Dutton anything more to get him over or to try to get him over the line? Do you think he'll even bother, or do you think he's written off the prospects of getting?
I think there's that growing feeling within the Labor Party that no, Dutton's not going to be there on the front line. There are going to be members of the Liberal Party who will stand up, and like you've got Linda Burney heading out to Orange in regional New South Wales this week.
Bridget Archer.
Yeah, Bridget Archer talking to Andrew Gee, who left the Nationals over this particular issue. That's
they want to highlight
probably the best.
Who are supporting it.
Yeah, probably the best they'll get to.
Also this week, a big move, albeit somewhat announced without too much fanfare, was on border protection. And look, Labor promised to abolish temporary protection visas before the election. They haven't quite gone that far, but they did move some 19,000 people. The so-called legacy caseload, people who came before 2013, they're refugees, they're now going to go on to permanent visas. It was interesting, the Home Affairs Secretary, Mike Pizzullo, he of course has been instrumental in Operation Sovereign Borders over many years. He insists, though, Labor has not ignored his advice.
Turnbacks, regional processing and temporary protection formed an interlocking set of measures. This government accepts that, and they accepted the advice that if you change any of those complementary measures that work as part of that interlocking architecture, you've got to offset the effects with appropriate mitigants. The government accepted that advice and has acted on that advice.
Appropriate mitigants. Do we know what they are?
I think that's called sophistry. Look, there was, I think, some awkward moments for Anthony Albanese about this in the House of Representatives, and because he was asked quite directly, did you receive advice that this could lead to, an increase in people smuggling activity? And he really belled the cat, I think, by the fact that he wouldn't answer that question for a couple of questions, right? And then you had Pizzullo come into estimates and very diplomatically, they should put him into DFAT when he's finished with that portfolio, saying, no, they're not going against our advice, but also, it came out and was revealed that they had given quite clear advice before the election that this is a suite of measures. I mean, I think it's really interesting to look at Labor's position in historical context, because you'll remember the big debates, I think at the 2015 ALP National Conference about boat turnbacks and that whole position where Anthony Albanese really broke ranks to vote in relation to that one against Bill Shorten. There was a number of other frontbenchers, Tanya Plibersek and Penny Wong, who wanted to do the same thing but felt unable, so they sent in proxies, one of the proxies being Katie Gallagher. And the person who moved that motion was Andrew Giles, the minister, the now immigration minister. I mean, that is an incredible march of Andrew Giles, essentially as a rebel, a radical within Labor about these issues, raging against TPVs all for years. Now he's the guy in charge. Now, obviously he will hope that. But
on this, on the TPVs though, what they're doing here, I mean, Peter Dutton was all guns blazing, right? This is going from Operation Sovereign Borders to Operation Sloppy Borders, he calls it. I guess this, Shane, only has traction though if boats do start turning up.
That's right. They'd be having to turn up at a cafe in Geraldton or Broome. I think that's when it would really kick off. But we get to the point, which is at the heart of this. What were you going to do with these 19,000 people? Like,
you keep putting,
and that's...
And there are still several thousand who remain in limbo, different categories of people here.
Yeah.
Pressure from the Teals and the Greens and others.
And there are terrible stories. Well. Like I read this terrible story about this woman that had been admitted to law school and was then told that she couldn't, basically, because she's on a TPV. Like, it is, keeping these people in limbo for so long is a problem. Yeah.
But what does it say, do you think, Dana, about Labor's approach now on the borders?
Well, it's a slight softening, isn't it? But this is hardly an advertisement. If you're looking to come to Australia to seek asylum, you could end up on some kind of decade-long wait in limbo and then eventually be given the chance to apply for a different visa. You could end up in offshore processing. You could end up being told you can never settle in Australia. So it's really, it's not that big of a change. It's more just resolving this ugly history that we have with people who we have left here in limbo deliberately for a very long time.
I think it is a big change in terms of the totemic nature of that in the debate. And I'm not saying that it doesn't need to happen, but I mean, you know, boat turnbacks, TPVs, you know, this is, you know, the big three basically. And so the question just remains, has the world changed? Right now, if the world's changed and the boats don't come, fine, you know, but if the world hasn't changed, I suppose we're going to find out.
But if the boats do come, they're still going to turn them back.
Well, they can't always. I mean, it depends on whether they find them, I suppose. But yeah,
a Navy surge is there to help stop that happen. But we shall see. Look, final one. Former Defence Minister Linda Reynolds, Sam, has given an interview to the Weekend Australian newspaper 2 years after her former staffer Brittany Higgins, of course, claimed to have been raped in the minister's office. Now, Senator Reynolds believes she was the target, she says, of an orchestrated plot and that Brittany Higgins was exploited by Labor figures and media identities. Sam, you broke the story, of course, originally around Brittany Higgins. The Weekend Australian says an email from the Finance Department at the time has cast some doubt on her claims that she didn't get enough support. Has it?
Look, I think there's a couple of interesting things about that interview. First of all, I mean, Linda Reynolds says that she's been unable to talk about these issues for many years because of the trial and so on. And fair enough, you know, she has a right to tell her story. I think on the allegation of an orchestrated plot, most of that seems to rest on a conversation that Linda Reynolds had with the late Kimberley Kitching in Parliament. She says that Kimberley Kitching approached her and told her some things before the publication. What she doesn't include, and what's not included, which I think is relevant, is that conversation was disputed. So before her death, Kimberley Kitching said that it didn't happen. So that's the first thing, that the orchestrated plot line relies on a disputed conversation. Moving to the email, I think that the email is really important, but I don't think it's important for the same reasons that Linda Reynolds does. So it's described as a secret email that is somehow kind of explosively going to question the compensation payout. It's not a secret email. It was actually reported by news.com in the very first story.
You wrote about this email
We wrote about it in the very first story, and because the government gave it to us to say, look, this is all the things that we did. We really did try to help this person, which I think is a legitimate point. We then quoted from it again a couple of days later.
Does it show the office was doing the right thing?
Yeah, it does to some extent, but I think the timing stuff is really important. Like, what it shows to me, and obviously some of these things are matters of personal interpretation, is I've always had a lot of sympathy for Fiona Brown, the Chief of Staff in the office. It was very clear in the trial she was absolutely devastated by the suggestion that she didn't do enough. She basically gets this email on the Friday saying these are all the things you need to do, right? But my question is this, right? Linda Reynolds is saying this email shows that I did everything I had to do. On her own evidence at the trial, she didn't know about the allegation on the Friday, right? And the email even says, and this is not quoted in the articles, you and the minister have basically said this to Brittany Higgins. Well, how can the minister have said that? They didn't even have a conversation about it yet.
Until later
So
on,
I just have some questions about that. And also in relation to the trial, Linda Reynolds and Fiona Brown had a slightly different account of who was told what. So her Chief of Staff actually says that she did tell her some things on the Friday. She can't remember that. Fair enough, people have different recollections, but there's a lot more detail that I think needs to be unpacked in relation to some of her claims.
A lot more detail, and unfortunately we have time.
But before we go on, we do need to say,
quickly,
that you're going to give the
I'm going to give
legal...
one up. No, go.
Well, I think we need to make clear that Mr Lerman, the charges were dropped, juror misconduct, and he, since he was charged, has maintained his innocence.
Yeah, correct. Good to point that out. All right, we do need to move on. And our panel, Dana Morse, Shane Wright, Samantha Maiden, will be back shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mark Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with screenwriter and author Zoe Norton Lodge, and a very warm welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Zoe, there were high rates of interest in Senate estimates this week as the RBA Governor, Philip Lowe, gave them the lowdown, and there seemed to be a lot of animosity towards the Governor.
It's all a little bit baffling, isn't it? That it's like the only way to kind of like control things is to cripple everybody. Pretty brutal. I don't know anything about economics, but there has to be another way.
Mark Knight's drawn him on the rack, getting stretched.
Yeah, and my favourite thing about this cartoon is like nothing says that you're not memorable than when they have to write low on your briefcase.
Yeah, that's right.
It's just to let people know, oh, it's that guy.
The poor home loan mortgage holder, let's see how you like it. Ah, look, ducking stool. Matt Golding, please take a seat, Mr Lowe, as the Senate estimates people are getting ready to...
You know, they should set this up at the Royal Easter Show, don't you think?
Senate estimates would be something to photograph if they had a ducking stool. Zoe, I did love this Brolman cartoon who's drawn the RBA Governor as the spy balloon.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people would like to shoot down the interest rates more than the spy balloon. He's not really living up to the name Low, is he? Like, Low made sense until about mid-2022.
Yeah.
And I think he really should maybe consider depolling and becoming Philip High.
Philip.
Yeah, and then end of this year can be just Philip Unconscionable.
Zoe, they say love means never having to say you're sorry, but in politics, an apology still is remembered 15 years later.
To me, it doesn't really smell like you've made a lot of progress if you're commemorating the time you apologised 15 years ago.
Yeah. It's got a real sort of a Santa look going on, Kevin Rudd.
Bless him. Well, that's a nice change from just looking shouty and angry, isn't it?
And, of course, in Parliament, Peter Dutton got up and said that he was sorry that he wasn't sorry 15 years ago.
I mean, I just want to boycott his apology for not apologising, if I'm honest. It's too late. You can't just have a personality trait. I don't buy it.
I did love this David Rowe cartoon, the closing the gap lift, and he's trying to squeeze in through the door here, which is shut on him. Apologies. Is there room for one more? No? Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, just know when you're not. You know, you don't want to be that person who shows up to a party and it's like they weren't invited. They definitely weren't invited. Nobody wants them there. Just take the cue and just leave. Do what you did before. Go.
You're right, though. All he had to do was sit there.
He didn't have to... Yeah, he had to just sit there. Like that.
Kathy Wilcox does a great Dutton too. She's really captured him here, I think.
Yeah.
I'm sorry that everybody else didn't fail to grasp the symbolism of my boycotting of the apology.
I know. Yeah. She's really... The face is amazing. There's something... Yeah. That's him, right?
Finally, the carbon offset system may be hard to understand, but sometimes you need a cartoonist to really get at the nub of the matter here. And this is a lovely David Pope. He's got Father Onion and Father Bulldozer here up on the wall.
Yeah. Looking down on everyone.
Yeah, and the big captains of industry here are going in for their confession. Forgive me, Father, for I intend to sin against the climate targets by opening a new fossil fuel project.
Please purchase an indulgence when you exit through the offsets shop.
Yeah.
I love this. It's such a great metaphor for what's going on. Like, oh, that's why it sits really badly with me. Oh, right, thank you.
Look, it's been a great pleasure unpicking the events this week, and I'll let you do the honours.
Back to you, David.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Sam.
Back on Linda Reynolds, but not in relation to the matter we were discussing earlier. There's been a lot of strange things happening in Senate estimates where she's been asking questions about two former staff members that were subjected to Australian Public Service Code breaches and a suggestion, or a refusal really, to answer questions on her part about whether she directed them to do something and what they did. Let's hope that she starts telling us.
We'll see. Shane.
I love the Olympics, and I think that we should, at the Brisbane Olympics, there should be a 100k trail marathon. It's the fastest growing running sport in the world, ultra trail running. However, London to a brick, I'll sell your home, Sam's home, mine home. We'll put everybody's property that the cost of the Brisbane Olympics will blow out. Every Olympics since the 1960 has blown out. We got this week the fact that the cost of upgrading the Gabba for the Olympics has more than doubled. So anyone who says, yep, it's going to be on budget, they're just lying to you.
All right. Dana.
My new favourite thing, ChatGPT. They're talking about it in the opposition party room. They want to know what the implications are for public policy. Are we going to get ChatGPT written bills? should ChatGPT be running the RBA? I love it.
No.
Obsessed with it.
Might do a better
My
job,
favourite
someone
thing.
suggests.
That would be the Dorothy Dixon. ChatGPT.
Thank you all very much. Now, the Nationals' Sam Birrell may be unknown to many. He's a first-term MP. But he certainly grabbed some attention this week. He jumped on stage with a guitar at an event in Parliament House. He even boasted that he could do a better job than Scott Morrison did with the ukulele. Well, Hugh Parkinson decided to put that to the judges to decide. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Take me to the April sun in Cuba. Oh, take me to the April sun in Cuba. I can't remember the words.
I'm not being rude, but that voice should come with a government warning.
Yeah.
Probably the worst voice I've heard.
Take me to the April sun in Cuba. Take me where the April sun's gonna treat me so right, so right.
I think you've got an absolute joy inside you, and you let it out in that song, and it was fabulous to watch for me.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.